Today, I'm just going to tell you what we're going to talk about. Instead of leading you there, we're going to talk about trust. And we're going to talk about trust because of you. Not that anyone's done anything wrong, quite the opposite. As you may recall, back during the season of Lent, which is the 6 weeks before Easter, we had a wondering wall. And each of those weeks, I would ask you a question, and I would invite you to offer your questions and comments on a piece of paper, and we would stick it up on this wall. Anybody remember that? Judy's like, I did it. I made it all happen. Yes, I'm glad you remember, Judy. Okay. So at the end of that, Connie actually took all of those and typed them up. And then, so I have this like 4 pages of all of our questions and prayers and concerns. And so I have been looking at that. And so all of the sermons this month have to do with trying to dig into some of our own questions. And today, trust came up in a bunch of different forms. There wasn't one question where I thought, I want to answer that because it's hard, right? There's no context. You just have these beautiful questions. But trust, what is it? How does it work? We're not going to answer all of that, but it did send me back to this book, and I'll show it to you. And those who know me well would know that I love Brené Brown, and Brené Brown, who is an author and scholar, quotes this guy for her definition of what is trust. And this man is Charles Feltman, and this is called The Thin Book of Trust. And if you know anything about writing thin, fewer words is really hard. And it's a good book. It's a good read. And in this, Feltman identifies trust as, and I'm quoting, choosing to risk making something you value vulnerable to another person's actions. You want to hear that again? Yeah. Choosing to risk making something you value vulnerable to another person's actions. Yeah? Yeah. Then he has this cute little pull-out card, which helps you determine drivers of trust. What are the drivers of trust? And they are these: sincerity, care, reliability, and competence. So those 4 things drive trust, according to Feltman. So I wonder if we think that Jesus is worthy of our trust. Yeah. I know that's what I did too. I was like, sincere, ding, reliable. We can go, I don't know. Competent, pretty competent, I'd say. Caring, yes. Done. You're welcome. Which, of course, is not the easy part, right? Because we have this scripture, we have lots of scriptures where people who are this close to Jesus don't seem to trust him, and they're afraid, and they have all of these feelings, and they don't listen, and right? They're disciples, they're humans. So in our scripture, what does Jesus make vulnerable? He's showing trust to humanity, and I would offer that he makes himself vulnerable. He puts himself out there again and again, and in fact, our scripture opens. He's just fed the 5,000, and he's like, y'all go on the boat. I'm going to go take a break up this mountain to pray. He's taking a little self-care time. I know there are a lot of sermons out there about Jesus needed some self-care, so do you. But that's not today's sermon. So, how are the disciples responding? In the midst of this crazy storm, Jesus, of all the things you could see, wouldn't that be good news, Jesus walking on water to you? Isn't that kind of the hope and the dream? But that's not what happens, right? We have these vulnerable folks, and they're in the boat, and let's just remember who they are. A lot of them are sailors. So you have fearful sailors in the boat, and that's either because they forgot who they were, or it's a really bad storm, right? They're freaking out, and they have all of this fear, and they're like, who is that? And I wonder what it is they're afraid of. Is it their eyesight? Is it the storm? They think this might be a ghost coming at them. They're really confused, and we don't quite understand why. But we do get that this isn't really normal. People walking on water, right? And we know that in perspective, if you look at the scriptures, there may be a little bit more going on here than just a boat on the water. Because in our scriptures and in the tradition, Jesus goes up the mountain to pray. And mountains are considered that place between the land and heaven. And so if you go up the mountain, you are going to go seek God. Remind you of some other stories, I hope? Okay. So we have another piece in this, which is God is the one who tames the water. Happens at creation, happens in other places, but water is kind of a stand-in for chaos, and it's only God that can come and make it okay. So we have Jesus who's just gone up and hung out with God and then comes back down and seems to be God-like, taming the chaos. Do you think that there should be some fear in that boat? Depends on what's happening, right. And what also is interesting is that Jesus calls out to them and he says, hey, it's me, don't be afraid. And the words that I gave for hey, it's me is actually the same words that we see for in Moses with the burning bush, where God reveals God's self and says, I am that I am. And here we have the same words, Jesus saying, I am God, right? Big moment in Scripture. And also we have some similar words that we have seen before, which is like, do not be afraid. And you would think after all of these stories, God would find some way of connecting with us that wasn't scaring us out of our wits. But God can't seem to figure that out. So here we have once again, hey, don't worry, I got this, I'm right here. And the people are like, what? Okay, that's our context. So let's stick with that moment where the people are like, what? And they're afraid, rightfully so. And in the midst of all of this, we have Peter, who does this really bold thing. Peter asks Jesus if it's okay to follow him out into the water. And I feel like all this trust stuff is clicking, and Peter's like, Feltman and I got this. Something's right about this guy. I'm going to go for it. And Jesus says, come. And so Peter gets out of the boat. And that's, going back to our definition of trust, a pretty vulnerable thing to do. Stepping out on faith out of the boat, because let's go back to this. What is our definition? It is choosing to risk making something you value vulnerable to another person's actions. So he's making his whole body and being vulnerable as he goes out onto that boat. Trust. Good job, Peter. And that is exactly what the piece of this story I think we should celebrate. That moment is huge and crazy. And if I saw any of you doing that, I would be like, come back into the boat, right? It's totally outside of the normal thing you should be doing. But he knows Jesus is trustworthy. And he takes this big risk. And he puts his whole self in the middle of that. He risks it all. And then he looks down and he sees and he feels that wind on him and he goes, oh. And he starts to go down, which also feels very human to me. And that's the piece where frequently we hear Peter kind of get one of these from Jesus. And I would say maybe there's another way to frame that. because I think tone of voice is important. And we don't quite know what it is, but I want to read this to you because the Message Bible is not a strict translation, it's an interpretation. And in this, you hear the voice of Jesus sound a little bit more like a parent rather than a strict, And it says, so this is from the Message, it says, jumping out of the boat, Peter walked on the water to Jesus. But when he looked down at the waves churning beneath his feet, he lost his nerve and started to sink, and he cried, "Master, save me." And Jesus didn't hesitate. He reached down and grabbed his hand, and then he said, "Faint heart, what got into you?" What got into you? You had that. You were on the water. You're doing fine. Good job. Being vulnerable, taking big risks does not mean it's going to go perfectly that first time, but he did it for a minute, right? It's kind of like the kid learning to ride the bike, and he gets up for a second, and then he realizes they're up, and he goes, doop. I did that for a very long time. It took me a while to learn to ride a bike, so I can appreciate that. Sometimes it takes me a long time to learn other skills, too. Feltman, talking about trust, does not say that trust is a recipe for jumping to success. He does suggest that one needs trust in order to make the world better and our lives more fulfilling. But he doesn't promise that taking that moment of vulnerability is going to make everything go just right. And also, let's just take a minute and remember that one person, 1 in 10 people on that boat that day, had a very big, trusting, vulnerable, brave moment. 1 out of 10. And that made a difference. That made a difference. Peter stepping out in faith, and even though he didn't go and dance around on the water and have this big moment, he ended with some failure and some fear. But him doing that and that whole succession led us to the rest of them saying, wow, that is God. Wow. Him risking and doing a great job and then having this very human moment of failure wasn't a failure, because he brought the other 9 with him, and they all go, wow, that's amazing. That is God. We see it now. Which is why I feel like we should stop doing this to poor Peter. Because I think at the end, risking a lot, having a great success, having a failure led to other people having a wonderful experience of God in their midst. And that is something that we should celebrate. Failure can also lead to wonderful things and lead to God being known right in our midst. So let us be brave, and let us be vulnerable and trusting in God, knowing that success or failure, whatever that looks like on the water, other people are watching, and our loving and risking can make a difference. So may it be.